When this process started out and the House initially took their first vote, there were two Democrats who voted not to move forward with the impeachment process. Do we know how the votes are going to line up today?
We know that in this committee it is going to be a straight party line vote. This committee is filled with individuals for whom there is no gray area. All the Democrats are going to vote yes. All the Republicans are going to vote no, both on Article 1, abuse of power, and Article 2, obstruction of Congress. It's when we get to the full House vote that things are a little less settled. There are a handful of Democrats who have said to us that they don't know how they're going to vote, that they're reading these articles, that they're weighing their options, and that this is a very big decision. These are mostly Democrats who come from swing districts who know that their reelection effort is going to get a little harder, potentially, if they take this controversial vote. And so they are either waiting until the very end to say that, yes, they are going to vote for impeachment, or perhaps they are going to hold out and vote no. And Democratic leaders are prepared for that. They know they could have, up to half a dozen defections, but they still believe that they are safe. They would need to lose more than 18 Democrats in order to see these articles of impeachment voted down, and they do not anticipate that that's going to happen.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up to that, Nancy. You covered Speaker Pelosi. You've covered her for many, many years. Are you hearing from her office, that there is an anticipation that for some of those Democrats in sort of those moderate districts that may not be able to vote for these articles of impeachment because of the sense from their own districts and their own constituents that that's okay, that she anticipates that, and she's counted those votes and has a level of certainty that it will pass?
Yes, they've been foreshadowing that because they know that the Republican argument is going to be, look, this was a bipartisan vote against impeachment, not for impeachment. And so, they're trying to cushion the blow by acknowledging now that, yes, there will probably be a handful of Democrats who vote no. And Speaker Pelosi said, and based on what we've heard from our sources, we know this to be true, that she's not whipping this vote. She's not urging members like she would in other situations to vote yes, to try to keep all of the Democrats together. She knows that this is a tough vote for some of her members from swing districts, and she wants them to get reelected. So if they believe that voting no is the best option for them politically, then she's going to allow them to do that, knowing that she does have this cushion and that she can afford to lose a few votes.
All right. Nancy Cordes for us on the Hill. Nancy, we will talk to you, I'm sure, when this all wraps up. Thank you very much, as always.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're seeing a live look right now on the Hill inside the Judiciary Committee hearing room. There's some children there.
I was going to say.
Well, this is,
teaching them
a little bit of
age.
history.
Well, it is
this
history,
is history
yeah.
in the making. The President of the United States, the House Judiciary Committee, set to vote on 2 articles of impeachment. It's only happened 2 other times.
Yeah.
And so this is history in the making. All right, let's get in CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper. She's joining us from Washington, and Republican strategist and CBS News political contributor Leslie Sanchez is joining us now from Washington. Antoine Seawright is on his way to represent the Democratic viewpoint into our bureau, so we'll talk to him when he lands. So Molly, to you first, I guess, what we saw play out yesterday, 14 hours of both Democrats and Republicans sort of in many instances, yelling at the cameras, yelling for the cameras.
And repeating themselves.
And repeating themselves over and over again. You heard Republicans saying that these articles of impeachment and the things that the president is accused of doing are not impeachable offenses. You heard Democrats saying he's a threat to national security and to our Constitution. What are you hearing from sources on the Hill about how both sides are feeling going into this impeachment, into ultimately the full House vote?
Well, I think both sides going into it knew that they weren't going to have any defections, really. In this Judiciary Committee, it's a very partisan committee, partisan on both sides of the aisle. You have your conservative firebrand, you have your liberal progressives, and again, this is one of those committees where the outcome is pretty much foreordained. But what's important, especially in the House and the Senate, of course, but the House, because it is so considered the people's house and kind of unruly, is the process and comedy that is established between members going into anything like this, especially a vote of such magnitude. And last night, I think the Republicans really were shocked when Jerry Nadler gavelled down the markup at 11:15 without taking a vote on the articles of impeachment, waiting until this morning, but not giving them any notice of that. And so I think that what we've seen play out in the run-up to this vote, and perhaps it'll change a little bit on the floor when Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer are more in charge of the floor dynamics. But just in terms of the respect and the respect you give other members of Congress, knowing that one day eventually your party will be in the minority and have to, be on the receiving end of these, you could say, parliamentary slights. But that's very in the weeds. Like I said, both sides going into this knew that the votes were going to end up party line, and really the big question mark is what a handful of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans may do when it comes to the full floor.
Leslie, to the outrage that Republicans displayed when they found out that the vote was going to be this morning and not in the wee hours of the morning or late last night, the Democrats, no matter what decision they made, whether they decided to have this late night vote or early morning or a vote this morning, the Republicans were going to be upset.
There's always a bit, you remind me, Anne-Marie, Ray LaHood, who was a member of Congress, Republican, who was one of the impeachment managers, came back and said that impeachment is one of the most acrimonious things Congress can do. We know there's going to be that contention. But what you saw last night was kind of really partisan dirty tricks. There was no need not to inform the minority that you weren't going to have the vote. The expectation the entire day was you were going to have the vote. So basically, they punted to do it today in front of the Klieg lights. That just reeks more of partisanship. And what it does, if anything, it's more divisive. It makes the process extremely difficult for people to understand that it's anything more than kind of this political folly. And that's what jeopardizes the whole effort of impeachment. Impeachment should be a consensus effort, not something that is so highly politicized. Of course, people are going to be mad. Of course, they're going to defend each other's side. But what we're at right now doesn't give people faith that they're doing it independently with good conscience as opposed to for partisan politics.
Molly, let me ask you this. I know that, as we said at the top, that you saw a lot of pontificating from both sides. But I think it's important for our viewers and for the American people who are watching this play out, understand what is at stake and understand what the arguments for impeachment, if you are a Democrat, and what the articles or what the sentiment from the Republicans is if you are not in support of this impeachment. So if you were watching CBSN and streaming us and you watched the entire thing play out, did the American people learn anything that would help them to make an informed decision as to what they expect to happen from the House of Representatives?
I think if you're a Democrat and you are in favor of impeachment, you gained more fodder for saying that keeping President Trump in office is a threat to national security of our U.S. elections. If you're a Republican and think this whole thing is a witch hunt and a sham, then I think that you came away with more talking points as to why you believe that no crime has been committed or charged, and how this is something that couldn't ever stand up in court.
All right,
so,
now, Molly,
again,
sorry, we got to interrupt you because Chairman Nadler has just gavelled in the House Judiciary Committee, a historic day on Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., they are set to begin the vote, or at least the process of voting on articles of impeachment of President Donald Trump. Here's Chairman Nadler.
Thank you. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, a quorum being present. Having agreed yesterday to the amendment in the nature of a substitute on articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump, the pending business is reporting the resolution favorably to the House. Reporting quorum being present, the question is now on the motion to report the resolution H-Res 755 is amended favorably to the House. Pursuant to Clause 5 of House Rule 16, because the resolution contains two distinct propositions, We will divide the question between the two articles. The question now is on Article 1 of the resolution, impeaching President Donald J. Trump for abusing his powers. The clerk will call the roll.
Those in favor say
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond?
Yes.
Mr. Richmond votes yes. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings?
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Yes.
Mr. Correa votes yes. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
No.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
My vote is no.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck?
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Radcliffe?
No.
Mr. Radcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby?
Aye.
Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong?
No.
Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Mr. Chairman, may I ask
Clerk
how
Orby.
I'm recorded?
How is
Mr.
the gentleman recorded?
Mr. Gomert, you are recorded as no.
Yeah, I want to make sure.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 17 noes.
The article is agreed to. The question now is on Article 2 of the resolution, impeaching President Donald J. Trump for obstructing Congress. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond?
Yes.
Mr. Richmond votes yes. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings?
Aye.
Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Yes.
Mr. Correa votes yes. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
No.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat? No. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
No.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Radcliffe? Mr. Radcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby?
No.
Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong?
No.
Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Is there every member of the committee who wishes to vote voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 17 noes.
The article is agreed to. The resolution is amended as ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. The resolution will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
pursuant to Clause 2L of Rule 11, I give notice of intent to file dissenting views.
Notice is heard. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
So there you have it, the House Judiciary Committee voting on 2 articles of impeachment. Both of them, the vote coming out the same as one would expect, 23 ayes, 17 noes.
So it's a historic day on Capitol Hill. As you point out, Anne-Marie, the House of Representatives has just passed 2 articles of impeachment. President Donald Trump. We've got reaction from our contributors. Molly Hooper is standing by in Washington, D.C. Leslie Sanchez, Republican strategist and CBSN political contributor, is also standing by. So, Molly, as expected, falling along party lines, but still, you know, I don't think we can. And what we were talking about before we watched Chairman Nadler gavel in the committee is just how historic this is. And I was asking you what people should take away if they're trying to decide what both Democrats and Republicans are putting forward. In other words, the Republicans saying that the things that the president is accused of doing do not rise to the level of impeachment. In fact, oftentimes you heard yesterday, which was rare, first time you actually heard members of Congress, Republicans, pointing to the call transcript and saying, look, here is the transcript, and we're defending what was in the transcript, Molly.
You did see more of that, and you actually saw them come forward with some, I guess, new information based on this OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, justification for the reason that the White House withheld, or at least the executive branch withheld this military funding for Ukraine, saying that the administration was waiting until 2 anti-corruption initiatives were passed in Ukraine. So take that for what it's will. The Republicans were actually arguing on those points, and here they are.
All right, so let's go to Louis. It looks like some members of Congress, Republicans, are gathering. There's Representative Louis Gohmert of Texas. Let's listen.
Big show. Everybody got dressed up, really no place to go. We voted on a provision, an allegation of abuse of power. There was an abuse of power at the Department of Justice. There was an abuse of power at the FBI. There was an abuse of power at the FISA court. There was abuse of power in our intel community. There was abuse of power. Even DOD was paying money to help set up the president. So there were all kinds of abuses of power, perhaps none more so than in the House of Representatives by the majority. This is an outrage. It sets the bar for any president of any party for the future to go through 3 years of hell like this president has. It's really unfortunate. This is a sad day for the country. It's going nowhere in the Senate, but I really hope and pray the Senate will not just pick it up and dismiss it. America needs to hear from the witnesses, and we didn't get to hear from them here. This was a kangaroo court. Outrageous to put the country through this, and we get a report, and we don't even get to examine the maker of the report. So it's a very sad day. I'm just glad I had such an incredible team I got to be on. These are really quality folks. Debbie, you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is really a travesty for America, and it's really tearing America apart. I have never in my entire life seen such an unfair, rigged railroad job against the President of the United States. I have known that my fellow Democrats were going to go for impeachment since January of this year when they got power. And here we are today. They predetermined they were going to do it, and they did it, come hell or high water. They had no proof, no evidence, no crime, but they went ahead anyway, and they're tearing the country apart, and they should be ashamed.
The founding fathers, the founders of this country, warned against single-party impeachments, and they had a very specific reason for warning us against that. They said that it would be bitterly divisive, perhaps irreparably divisive for the country, and that's what's happened now. This is the first time in the history of this nation, in 243 years, that a president has been treated in this manner, when one party has followed and pursued a predetermined political outcome to get to that end. You have to remember that before the famous July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky that supposedly sparked all of this whole charade, 95 House Democrats had already voted to proceed with impeaching Donald Trump before any of these facts came forward. That's just not right. They determined this. They said it from the day he took his oath of office that they would remove him, and they pursued that end. So this is what we're left with. 14 hours yesterday and a few moments this morning, this anticlimactic end to this whole charade was fitting and appropriate. There wasn't much there. And that's what happened here. I think the American people are going to militate against this. I think the polling shows that they've been very frustrated. They see what's happened here. They see the lack of evidence. They see this paper-thin impeachment proceeding, what ultimately developed of it, that there's nothing behind it. I think we showed that very clearly. And I think there's going to be a huge political price paid by the Democrats at the polls next year. And what we're ultimately concerned about, beyond the price that's paid in this short-term period, is what this is going to do to our republic going forward. The founders were right. They have divided the country even further, and I think that it's going to be very difficult for us in this institution to put this genie back in the bottle, and that's ultimately what we're all so concerned about.
In the media, you should hold the Democrats to the standard that they set for themselves. Not the standard they set back in 1998 when Jerry Nadler said that impeachment would have to be supported by substantially a bipartisan group to be legitimate. Look at the standard they set for themselves just a few months ago. Democrats said that the evidence would have to be overwhelming, and yet in hearing after hearing, the evidence they presented was either hearsay, speculation and conjecture, or the result of a policy disagreement about how to treat the Ukraine. Democrats promised that after public hearings there would be some newfound animated public support for impeachment. The reality is they failed to meet their burden. And so now, with no bipartisanship, matter of fact, the only bipartisan vote will be a bipartisan vote against impeachment. With no direct evidence, with no enhanced public support for impeachment, Democrats will continue to visit the opportunity costs for this division on our country. As Republicans, we would like to work on infrastructure, on asylum reform, on policy changes that will actually impact the quality of life for our constituents. But for Democrats, impeachment is their drug, it is their obsession, it is their total focus, and it is deeply disappointing that they failed to meet the standard that they set for themselves. Questions?
Yeah, Congressman, do you guys worry about the precedent that this sets on obstruction of Congress? The fact that this administration did not comply, did not cooperate at any point with this investigation, which has not happened before.
No, the administration has cooperated with fair and reasonable oversight. But when Democrats made clear that this was not about oversight, it was about impeachment, it was about an illegitimate process, then I think that reasonably informed the administration's position on whether or not to validate this absurd process.
Wait a minute.
Both the Nixon and Clinton administrations cooperated or provided some information in their impeachment investigation.
Yes.
Have the charges changing constantly.
Let me address this as we did yesterday. You have to understand that the Trump administration has cooperated. Okay, just this year, they understand Congress's oversight and investigation responsibility, and they've acknowledged it. 25 members of the administration have testified before oversight. 20 have testified before the Judiciary Committee. When the impeachment proceeding began, over 100,000 pages were submitted by the White House to Congress pursuant to our request. And, of course, he immediately released the transcript, the famous transcript of the phone call. The president has not been obstructing this at all. What he's worried about is the process, is this unprecedented charade that's gone on. Adam Schiff controlling this in the basement, having secret hearings, cherry-picking witnesses, denying Republican questions, not allowing Republican witnesses to come forward. There's been no chance for the president's counsel to participate in the early stages of this. This whole thing was rigged. I'm an attorney. Many of us are. If we were advising our client, and our client in this case happened to be Donald Trump, we would tell him not to participate in that because it's an ambush. We got ambushed last night on the scheduling. At every stage of this, the Democrats have tried to railroad the president, and that's why he's had some concern. The fact that they brought an impeachment claim of obstruction is absurd. The Obama administration, the one just prior to this one, went to court. They didn't turn in pleadings and all the documents and witnesses that were requested in the Fast and Furious investigation. They went to the third branch of government. That's the way our system is set up. When there is a natural impasse that develops between the legislative and executive branches, we have the third branch of government, the judiciary. They could have easily gone a few blocks away to a federal court, gotten an order to compel the production of anything else they needed, but they didn't have time to do that. You know why? We all know why. Because they guaranteed to their radical left base that they would impeach Donald Trump by Christmas. That's why we're here. That's why we've done all this, and that's why they didn't go through the normal process, the custom and practice of every previous administration in the modern era.
At the end of the day, the Democrats control the House of Representatives. They can determine what the process is. You guys might not like it. There are politics in this. There were politics in 1999 with President Clinton. We hear what you're saying, but that said, don't they have the right to handle this in the fashion
They don't have the right to abuse the process, and this was a total abusive process. It was a witch hunt. That's why they could not settle on a charge until they had exhausted that there was no evidence of a crime. And let me just tell you, if the DOJ and the FBI went after you and your family and your business associates, harassed them, and you find out, as the president did early on, this was all a scam to bring him down, then you would be wise, and I bet most any attorney would say, don't you go and they're looking for anything. Don't help them crucify you. It would not be smart. The president did the right thing. The obstruction of justice was right here. Well, of course, also DOJ, FBI, but hopefully there'll be people pay for that.
McConnell says that he's not likely to bring forward witnesses in the Senate trial.
That'd be a big mistake.
You called for witnesses. How do you think that you're actually going to get your story out? This is not what McConnell
The
says
Senate
he
promised
wants.
that for months now they would have witnesses, and I really understand the desire. This was a ridiculous process, a report, no real witnesses here. So I understand their desire to just get it behind us, but the country needs to hear what a farce this was. They really need to bring in witnesses. They're the chance to clean this mess up, and I sure hope they will.
Congressman, this is a president who just yesterday called a teenager on the autism spectrum a person with an anger management problem. Does that make it harder to defend him this vigorously?
the president communicates in a unique way. He doesn't communicate the way I do and the way many of us would. But wait a minute, let me answer. 63 million Americans voted to make him the president of the United States. He has an unorthodox style. But what we're talking about in here is removing a president because the Democrats don't like that style. They don't like him. They don't like his Twitter account. They don't like many of his staff members. They don't like what he does in the office. But the way our system is designed, the way our Constitution is written, is the party in charge. Even if you have the majority in Congress, you don't get to remove a president because you don't like him. They did not produce a scintilla of evidence to support a charge of impeachment. And that is the question at the end of the day. That's why we're so frustrated. We may not have a trial in the Senate. The president may not get a chance to put on his witnesses and put on his defense, but we're going to do it to our constituents and the American people every opportunity we have. And I don't know. I think that's about it.
Why is it ever okay for an American president to ask a foreign power to investigate a political rival? Why do you think that's okay?
He didn't do that.
He did ask Zelensky.
He did not do that.
Yes. He asked President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. Why is it okay?
That was because I think logically, more likely than the Democrat story, is because he wanted to vet out the corruption. He had seen the video of Joe Biden bragging about how he was going to withhold $1 billion from Ukraine if they didn't fire the prosecutor, the same prosecutor that had been investigating Burisma, the corrupt company where his son was getting paid to be on the board. That's corruption. That had corruption, plain and simple, according to an Obama administration person on a similar case who said that is corruption, plain and simple. And I think it's the responsibility of the President of the United States, before he hands over taxpayer dollars, to investigate corruption. And I believe part of that corruption was with the Bidens.
He never mentioned corruption at all in that phone call.
Do you want witnesses at the second trial? Do you agree with that? I would. You want witnesses?
All right. You just heard Republicans there in front of the cameras answering questions from reporters.
Explaining why they voted against the articles of impeachment.
I'm sorry. Congresswoman Lesko, what she just said there is part of what you've been hearing over the course of the last couple of weeks from Republicans and from the president himself. Molly Hooper is standing by along with Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright is joining us here, Democratic strategist and CBSN contributor. But Molly, what Congresswoman Lesko just said is absolutely not correct. I mean, the idea that she pivoted from the question, which was a legitimate one, when is it okay for a United States president to ask a foreign country to look into a political rival? Congresswoman Lesko started talking about Joe Biden withholding billions of dollars in aid from Ukraine. Joe Biden, as vice president of the United States, had no authority to withhold anything. He was carrying. You explain to our viewers what Joe Biden was doing when that money was being held, Molly, because I know you've covered this.
Well, let me hit this point first. I know that in covering Capitol Hill a long time, members of Congress often answer the question they want to answer, not the one they were asked. It's a very unique technique. But Joe Biden at the time was voicing concern, voicing the opinion essentially of our U.S. allies that this corrupt prosecutor, and it didn't really have to do with Burisma, that if Ukraine did not get rid of this guy, we were not going to give them enough money or give them the funding. But it really, the two are kind of convoluted, and Republicans are confused. And the Republicans are using that, again, to pivot to the question they want to answer as opposed to the one that they are asked.
Right, because what Congresswoman Lesko was trying to suggest is that the president, in his capacity as the chief executive, was rooting out corruption in Ukraine, when in fact, according to the call transcript, according to all that we have on the record, the president doesn't talk about corruption in Ukraine. He talks about CrowdStrike and about the Bidens. And nothing in his comments, at least that we've seen, suggested that he was actually intent on rooting out corruption leading to to that phone call on July 25th, and even the so-called transcript doesn't indicate that. So I just wanted to clarify that, because if you listen to that and you come in to CBSN and you're watching Congresswoman Lesko respond.
He was trying to root out corruption. This was one example of corruption, but there's more to that story.
Exactly. There's way more to that story. I just wanted to jump in on this part. There is more to that story, and if you listen to George Kent, who is at the State Department, when he gave testimony before the Intelligence Committee, he was saying corruption really referred to this big anti-corruption effort that they had in the Ukraine to root out corrupt prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and it really, the Burisma Bidens were not mentioned in that.
No. The vice president was focusing on a corrupt prosecutor. Independent of the investigations, the prosecutor was corrupt.
Exactly.
Well, the whole system was corrupt, actually.
That's true. I mean, and I think that, in a way, Molly, it's very convoluted what happened in Ukraine. And I think that as a result, it's difficult for the American public to truly understand what went on. So you whittle it down to a bumper sticker. He was trying to root out corruption, and in many of these stories, there's a little bit of truth. There was a corrupt prosecutor. Burisma was being looked at, but these are at sort of two different times. And one prosecutor was replaced by another one. That prosecutor looked at Burisma and decided, well, it's not. There's nothing going on there right now. But listen, Antoine's been sitting here, and we haven't gotten a chance to talk to you yet, Antoine. So the Republicans were very, very upset that Jerry Nadler chose not to hold this vote last night and instead this morning. They were outraged. And the argument was, we weren't prepared. How can you just spring this on us? Why are you catching us off guard? What's that about?
I would just say what they said to us when we asked them not to release some highly sensitive information when they had hearings last year. Elections have consequences. Welcome to the Democratic majority. But I want to talk about all this idea or discussion around corruption. Because timing is everything. And that's what the general public does understand, timing. Keep in mind, for 2 years, the United States government, led by Donald Trump, gave the Ukraine country, the funding they needed from the United States. It wasn't until Joe Biden entered the presidential race and all the polls, including Fox News polls, had Joe Biden beating Donald Trump in some battleground places where he decided he wanted to look into the Ukraine corruption centered around Hunter Biden. Boo-Boo the Fool could understand that. And that's what the Republicans don't seem to understand, that's plain and simple. And the fact is, the president and his chief of staff, by the way, who's the OMB director, went on record bragging about what they wanted to do and what they did. And so this idea that the president was interested in corruption, that it wasn't about politics, I think that's just false. And I think people understand that once you get out of the noise and really focus on the lyrics.
So, Leslie, what about that?
Wow. This entire process is extraordinarily frustrating. And I have tried to be here every day through the 14 hours and the entire week. And I thought Republican Congressman Tom McClintock was right. Yesterday he said, let's stop the talking points. Let's stop this endless loop. If I get any more text, and I appreciate all the responses, but voters and the public are very tired of the same talking points going back and forth. And that's what we just heard, and that's what my colleagues are just saying. And let's get to the bottom line. The bottom line is they are voting on today. They voted on a report, a partisan report by Adam Schiff, who has been, targeting this president on impeachment for a long time, and a series of news articles. That's basically what they are bringing impeachment and voting impeachment on that thin basis. Whether you agree or disagree, that's just really not what a consensus-building operation is about. And they've called it a derelict of duty by these members of Congress, and they're right. This is not the way the process should be, and it's built on a case of hearsay, opinion and speculation. There's not those facts. And you heard the Republican members saying, look, if they were advising if Donald Trump was their client, they would advise them that the entire process is rigged against you. It's an ambush. Those were the words that were used. And that's true. People understand that. Why would you put yourself in that kind of environment? I tell you, people had the same kind of feeling during the market crash when they were dealing with the banks, that everything was working against them. That's how the Republicans feel right now. The system's rigged. rigged. And while you have it so partisan, that's what's frustrating, because there's a lot of us who believe impeachment is really that important step Congress has, that we should respect that step and not put it in this kind of ridiculous kind of political theater it's in right now. It's always going to have this contention. But can't we stop for a minute and say, let's do this? If you're going to bring impeachment, do it fairly in a process where all of us can get on board, because the way it is now, nobody can.
So, Antoine, you know, like part of the argument from the Republicans is, yeah, this is really important. There are some very important witnesses that work within the White House, spoke to the president that we haven't heard from. They have refused to come forward. But, you know, the argument is working its way through the courts. So why not wait and let the courts decide? And then if they refuse to testify in front of Congress, boy, do you have a strong case for at least obstruction of Congress.
Because there's several things the courts, for the most part, have Trump pause on them. Number two, what we do know is the court process is insulated, supposedly, from the political process. So it could be months, almost up until, almost like Comey's last drop before the next election, before we could even get to a ruling. So no, we can't do that. And the fact of the matter is, that's why Democrats want the majority to put in acts of accountability and checks and balances to this president. And you're never going to get the Republicans to buy into impeachment. You heard what Mitch McConnell said yesterday or this morning. He's working closely with the White House to be lockstep on the response of how the Senate Republicans conduct themselves. What if you look at every talking point that's come from the Republican conference and members who have been a part of this process, they have been lockstep repeating what the White House has been saying, including this idea, Vlad, that Ukrainians were the ones that hacked into our election. So this notion that you're going to get Republicans to buy into and make impeachment bipartisan in this environment, that's crazy, because it's never going to happen. The fact of the matter is, the president's supporters, his party is going to go in his corner, Democrats are going to go in their corner, and we're going to let the American people decide. But you're not going to get, we're not in 92, we're not in the Nixon era, so you're never going to get bipartisan groups of people to say, you know what, let's do impeachment. And this argument that it was about the last election, undoing the last election, that's not true. What Democrats have been crystal clear about, and what the evidence says, this is about the 2020 election. So I just want to make those points so that we can have some clear understanding from the Democratic side, at least.
All right, we're expecting Chairman Nadler to step before the cameras in just a moment. So when that happens, we'll go into that. There's a live shot there. But Molly, let me ask you something away from the partisanship, which is, so now the next phase of this, which is the potential trial in the United States Senate. Are you hearing from your sources who Speaker Pelosi will pick to prosecute the case in the Senate on behalf of the House of Representatives?
Well, a lot of people want it. It's going to be a big, high-profile job, but she hasn't made decisions yet. And keep in mind, Adam Schiff, who is the head of the Intelligence Committee, he has actually, as a member of the Judiciary Committee in the past, led House managers in impeaching federal judges over in the Senate. So he has a lot of experience with this. Jerry Nadler, of course, wants to take a central role, as do many of the Democrats. Like if you look at Eric Swalwell on the Judiciary Committee, Hakeem Jeffries, there's individuals who are former prosecutors and who are part of Pelosi's leadership team that want to play a starring role in this, if you will. But it's interesting because yesterday, Steve Chabot, a Republican on the committee, on the Judiciary Committee, was also on the committee in 1998 when the Judiciary panel impeached Bill Clinton and sent those articles to the Senate. Chabot said that he was selected to be an impeachment manager over in the Senate, and he said, I got to tell you, in retrospect, it's an ugly process, and I feel really sorry for whoever is picked to be a House manager, because it's something that is very divisive and weighs on you, and it's very heavy, and we get caught up so much in the partisanship these days that it's hard to sort of step back and say, what's going on here? What's the ramification of this? And I think that to hear him say that caught me off guard a little bit.
Could you potentially, Molly, see, and I know that both Chairman Schiff and Chairman Nadler have constitutional law experience, but I'm thinking back to the Clinton impeachment, and the Republicans there were all white males, and I'm wondering if perhaps showing sort of a sense of diversity in the Democratic Party, that you could see somebody, for example, like Val Demings from Florida, even though she doesn't have a constitutional background. She was a former law enforcement officer. Antoine wants to jump in.
Yeah, you can say it. You can say it.
Just jump in.
I think you'll see some African American females, some African American leaders within our caucus ascend themselves as they've done through this hearing. Val Demings, Terry Sewell, Karen Bass. There are a number of African American leaders within the caucus who will essentially, likely end up being impeachment managers and watching this process. Joe Neguse from Colorado. A lot of rising stars we saw rise to the top during this process, and that's a direct reflection of the most diverse caucus in U.S. history that the Democrats have, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, and I think, Molly, I wonder, so I hear the betting game in D.C. now is, who's going to be that person to lead that impeachment trial for the Democrats. But you said something interesting. You said that a lot of people are saying that they don't want it, but then there's others who probably, because of the historic nature of this impeachment, will want to be the one.
Well, she said a lot of people want it, but there's a warning.
There's a warning, right? A warning label, right?
It may not be what it's cracked up to be.
That's right. Caveat emptor, right?
Yeah,
it's
right. Now you got what
Senate.
you wanted. Now what are you going to do? Right?
Now what are you going to do with
finally
it?
Caught the car.
Have fun. That's right. You caught the car.
Now what do you do?
So listen, Molly, throughout this whole process, the Republicans have complained that they haven't been able to get the witnesses that they want. And so I'm wondering just how much influence and sway do we expect the Democrats to have when it comes to the Senate trial and witnesses?
Well, see, and that's the big question. I mean, it all kind of comes down to what Mitch McConnell and the White House attorneys figure out they can accomplish over in terms of the process for a Senate trial. Because remember, you need to have 51 votes to move ahead with creating this process that we will see unfold over in the Senate. And there are a number of Republicans who were going into this before the impeachment vote were uncomfortable with what the president said, what was done. They've also been very uncomfortable with how the House Democrats have handled it, and I say Democrats because they're in charge of the House. And the rights that they've given to Republicans over in the House to call witnesses. So right now it's a bit unclear. And here's Jerry Nadler.
Molly, I'm going to cut right. Oh, there you go. She
Nice
did it
job.
for us. Very nice.
You don't need us.
Okay. Today is a solemn and sad day. For the third time in a little over a century and a half, the House Judiciary Committee has voted articles of impeachment against the President for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The House will act expeditiously. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, are you disappointed that we know obstruction of justice? So why would you take
Okay, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee not taking any questions at all, short and sweet. But I think he's a little bit. I mean, he has taken questions before for a number of things, but I think it speaks to how he presented today's vote, how serious it really is. And yeah, sometimes we can be sort of lighthearted about this conversation, but the truth of the matter is that it is historic. It is very serious. And as we move forward, we are essentially sort of reinterpreting or interpreting the Constitution, right? So what are we going to allow presidents to get away with? How do you define abuse of power? It's ill-defined right now, and we're adding to this definition as we move forward.
Right, and I feel like our job as journalists is to try and clarify to our viewers and to the American people what this really means and what it will mean for not only what it means for the President of the United States, but what it means for the future of this republic. And I think that that's why we want to bring in our experts and talk to our reporters who can sort of help people understand what is happening. Because I get it. There are a lot of people who say, look, this has been hours and hours and hours and months and months and months of the same stuff we keep hearing. Yes, he did it. No, he didn't. Yes, this was a perfect call. No, this wasn't a perfect call. And I can understand how people's eyes glaze over. But my sense is that, as we move forward in this process, it's going to be more important and incumbent upon all of us to try and clarify to our viewers what is actually happening and how this will affect their lives and the lives of their children, because that's really what we're talking about.
And that's why it's very concerning when we say, the outcome of the Senate trial is a foregone conclusion. Right? We shouldn't be able to say that. The role of the Congress and the role of the Senate is to make sure that the president is doing what he's supposed to do, that the president is fulfilling his role and not violating the Constitution. Sorry, Leslie, I think that's you, right?
Yeah,
okay,
yes. You know, Anne-Marie, in spirit, I'd love to think this is a civics class and we're learning the proper way to go about impeachment. You know, we're all very nebulous and we're very, you know, what's the definition? And I was here on the Hill, you know, in '98 when the Clinton impeachment happened. And the big thing we keep forgetting to say is there was a third-party entity, a Department of Justice, special counsel that came forward with boxes and boxes of information, just like the IG report that we just heard about abuse of the FISA courts, that caused America to pause, that caused Republicans and Democrats to come together and say, wait a minute, this is somebody who spent 2 years investigating this, and we have to listen to the merits of that argument. Were there obstruction, where there wasn't? That was done with Robert Mueller. And Senator Lindsey Graham talked about that. Had Mueller come forward and said something in this case, this would be a different conversation. But it wasn't. This entire process is so partisan. And I'm not the first one to come forward and say, oh, and look at it that way with this kind of not giving a fair balance. I try to listen, like a lot of us, to both sides. But when it's so hyper-partisan, and you talk about cherry picking of the witnesses, not allowing for a minority hearing, 100,000 documents and pages presented to the courts, but not really included. As much as you may dislike Republicans and dislike this president, you can't look at this process and say it's fair, which is why when we transfer to the Senate, you're looking at Republican senators as the cooling process. Molly talks about that all the time, Molly Hooper, that's going to say, wait a minute, it's not legitimate, so we're not going to give it that legitimacy. And that's the difference. I want us to take away why it's so different from Clinton and why it was different from Nixon, and it is this environment that we're in.
Leslie, another thing that's different, if I recall, and Molly would probably know better than me, is I don't think you had the Senate working with the president's lawyers as they move forward towards a trial. I mean, we talk about, sort of not wanting this to be a partisan process, but that's pretty concerning, Leslie.
Well, I'm going to let Molly. Well, what I was going to say is actually no. The Senate did work with the White House attorneys because they knew how serious this was to establish a process that was fair to both parties. In fact, the Democrats and Republicans one day in early January 1999 got together in a closed-door session all day to hash out what are going to be the rules for this upcoming Senate trial. And both sides, the defense and the Republicans, they both had 3 days to put on their cases, and the biggest issue that both parties had was which witnesses do we call. And actually, when a number of Republicans wanted to call Monica Lewinsky to come appear before the Senate, they did agree to have her give a deposition behind closed doors, which was then played on the floor. But the whole Senate, 70-30, voted against calling Monica Lewinsky. At that time, the central figure in that impeachment trial, they voted against calling her up to appear before them in person. And really, Republicans and Democrats worked together pretty well during that period, and Republicans were in the majority in the Senate, and Bill Clinton was in the White House, a Democrat. So it is very, in that sense, it sort of was similar, but
here we have a Republican-dominated Senate working with a Republican president.
Exactly, but I do think that you will have Republican senators, again, who have voiced concern. This was not a perfect call, that, like the president says it was, but they can point to the fairness. Going to Leslie's point, the lack of fairness or the perceived lack of fairness by the House Democrats over on the House side, and say, how do we work with you? Moderate Republicans were almost looking for a reason to waver on this idea of do we impeach or do we not. But in shutting them down in the House, at that point it becomes all about process.
So a couple of things. We had a third-party prosecutor in Mueller that the Republicans wanted, that they went on to attack him through the entire process. And what we learned from that report, the key thing in that report was two things. One, Russia hacked into our elections. Two, that report did not exonerate the president, which means everyone knows that means he puts the pressure on the Congress to do their duty and responsibility. This process started because the whistleblower had a complaint that went through the Trump's Department of Justice, that his inspector general then said that this was an issue, it needed to be flushed out. That's how we even got here. So this idea of engaging DOJ, et cetera, that process was somewhat touched and rubbed on. Number three, we all know about Trump's Attorney General Barr and his position and how he functions and fluctuates with his office, and those things cuddle and play footsie all into Donald Trump. So this idea that Barr is going to be fair and just through an impeachment process, I think we are kidding ourselves. And number three, the next thing is, I think people forget that Donald Trump sat down with George Stephanopoulos and said that he would invite dirt from a foreign entity again into our elections. That's what Mueller was all about. And so to think that we cannot check him for saying he's going to do this, knowing what happened in the last election, so where does this end? What would happen if the Democrats say, okay, China, let's dig up dirt on the Republicans for a Senate race or House race? Do we just say, no, it's okay? That's what this is about. This is about putting a stop point, and so that as we go forward in this American experiment, it does not happen again. That's why it's all about national security. And one more point. These hearings were done in private, with 47 or 46 members of the Republican conference. They went crazy saying we need to do them on TV, they need to be open to the public. Now here we are, and they still refuse to have key witnesses testify, like some Trump officials, including his OMB director and chief of staff. So I think we have to just gather all the facts when we talk about this process not being fair and balanced, and the Democrats are somehow tilting the process.
So, Leslie, is it your sense, you've talked about being there for the Clinton impeachment, and Anne-Marie and I were sort of writing notes to each other as we were listening to this, thinking about that impeachment and the Senate, which then was in Republican hands, Republican majority in the Senate, and Trent Lott, who was the Republican Senate Majority Leader, saying to Tom Daschle, then the Minority Leader from South Dakota, that they had to work together to make sure that this was done in a fair and responsible way, right? You had one Democrat, one Republican saying, look, as Molly has said in the past, the cooling effect that the Senate will have on the House of Representatives, as represented by Senator Trent Lott and Tom Daschle. Are we to think now, because of what Mitch McConnell said yesterday on Fox News, that we're not going to get that this time around?
No, I think that the interesting thing, and I know Molly could talk about that too, with the Senate, we talk about the tremendous, Republicans in the majority, but these senators have a tremendous amount of power. Every individual senator could gum this up, and this is a very unique process that, again, they can orchestrate it any way they want to. And part of this thing, when we're thinking about even Clinton, I'm glad that you mentioned that. There were some Democrats who came on board with Republicans and voted. You're not going to see that next week, but they crossed over the aisle in terms of supporting the idea of that. But the American public felt that President Clinton was moving forward, keeping and working for the good of the people. They did not feel what he did merited impeachment. It's always that two-part effort. So they may not, in this case, they may not agree with the call or think that something's odd about the call, meaning the Senate, but they don't believe, and the American public doesn't believe, that it merits removal from office. And that's this cooling, this kind of understanding what measure and was it done in fairness. Lindsey Graham said yesterday he's going to be looking at the record of what was presented in the House, and meaning all the testimony, and meaning the very partisan report of Adam Schiff and all these news articles. If you listened to yesterday, this introducing the Time magazine and introducing, the Wall Street Journal and introducing the Washington Post. I mean, it was just this great reporting by journalists, but as the members have said, they are it's a derelict of duty for them not to investigate beyond that and just to rely on third party. So all of that being said, I do expect the Senate to be, you've got this cross pressure between, do you legitimize this? Lindsey Graham doesn't want to. He wants to move ahead very quickly. And McConnell, who's going to kind of come up with the right balance to allow everybody to feel that this was a thorough process. They're not going to dismiss it outright.
Molly, Leslie just said that the American people, don't want to see the president removed. And the truth of the matter is that as we've been doing polls sort of every other week or so, the polls had been increasingly ticking towards more and more people wanted to see the president impeached and removed. And then suddenly, it almost seemed like when we were hitting crunch time, the polls started to move in the other direction. Molly, what do you think's happening?
Well, you know, that is a good question. And let me do my little pivot here. I'll answer the question I wanted you to ask. Just kidding.
That's fine. You can do that.
But it goes to that. Think about it. Removing a federal official from office is a two-step process, and it was set out in the Constitution. And the House, think about who gets removed. The president, who can be removed. The president, the vice president, judges, federal judges, and essentially political appointees, right? Like your cabinet secretaries. And really, that has only been done a handful of times in our history. And the Constitution makes it very difficult to actually remove an elected official from office because, you know, as Republicans point out, and Democrats back in 1998, you know, millions of Americans voted for one person to take the role of president. And if you remove that individual from office, you're essentially taking away somebody's vote, you know, their aggrandizement, essentially, which is why it's so difficult to do. And so I think that the polls, it's hard to, Anne-Marie, we were talking about this earlier, during the Intelligence Committee hearings, we were talking about Ukraine and all these sort of convoluted matters. But back in 1998, lying under oath about sex was not difficult to understand.
Right.
You know, I mean, having a president on tape lying about it, that was not difficult to understand. Whether it was impeachable or not, different matter. But this issue in particular, and Nixon as well, breaking into the DNC, telling your officials to do it. People understand that, right? But in this matter, it's a little more difficult.
One part to that was really the clarifying factor for the American public. In impeachment, you had tapes, and in Clinton, you had address. And there was something you could really see. This was not a case where Donald Trump, where he had, you know, $400 million in his refrigerator. There was not this like wad of cash, you know. So it wasn't this kind of understanding that this connected. It was more hearsay and how you viewed it versus actual evidence.
But I wasn't too old in '92 in that time period, so I can't give you all the details around that.
You're supposed to wait for like someone else to say that. Like you were just a young whippersnapper. How would you know?
I don't. So
he's ready to say, "Okay, boomer."
let me say it the South Carolina way. I don't have as many miles on my engine as some of you.
Wow.
Hey, but you can go to C-SPAN. They have all the tapes.
But I will say, I don't know. Well, first of all, we did not have a 24-hour news cycle in either one of those cases in which you have the left and the right just going into their corners, pumping up the volume about how they see this process. Number two, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if there was a scenario in which people were told not to testify on the record, particularly people who had direct involvement in the situation. So that's why these two cases are totally different. And from the very beginning, you asked why the polls changed to Molly, and I'm going to borrow your question and try to give you answers as I see it. The polls have slipped in some places, in some cases, because through this entire process, the Republicans have tried to make this a circus. They wanted to tamper down the process, tamper the facts, beat on the process to confuse even more the American public so people can say it's a wash, it's a waste of time. Here's what you cannot dispute. My dear friend Leslie mentioned there was a dress and there were tapes. Well, there was a tape. There was Trump on the front lawn of the White House saying what he did. And there was a tape of Mick Mulvaney at a press conference saying the same thing. So there were two tapes. That's why you see these impeachment articles very narrowly drawn and focused and not giving any wiggle room for error or any wiggle room for people to guess.
Those tapes, they thought they were going to use for an article related to bribery, which ultimately the Democrats did not have enough any evidence overall in either of these. They basically went to the lowest common denominator where they didn't have to have actual evidence. So I don't buy the theory on the tapes. And I want to agree with you, Antoine, on let's find something to agree on, because I think that's where, you know, a lot of us want to be moving, but not in this particular area.
All right, we're going to continue this discussion on the other side of this hour with some of our contributors, but I want to thank Molly Hooper in D.C., Leslie, and Antoine as well. Always a spirited discussion when we have all of you on our air. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back. We'll be doing some other news that we want to share with you because there are other things happening around the world.
Yes.
So we want to get to some of that, so stick around.